Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we delve further into the wisdom of meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. We deeply appreciate your support. Please take a moment to like and share this audiobook, helping us expand its reach and granting more individuals access to its profound insights. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for instant notifications when new content is released. Together, we can disseminate the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, fostering a community dedicated to enlightenment and inner peace. Your participation in our mission to make these transformative teachings universally accessible is truly invaluable. Let's begin today's reading. So little time. September 17, 2015. We have so little time. As the Buddha said, even if you have a long life, it's 100 years, which may seem long, but as you're approaching the end, you look back and it's nothing. Time eats everything as it eats itself. We're encouraged to have unlimited mind states, unlimited goodwill, compassion, empathetic joy, equanimity, but our resources are limited, our time, our energy, which means that we have to choose our issues very carefully. Notice that after the Buddha's awakening, the issue that he focused on was one that all of us have in common, which is that we want happiness, and yet our actions lead to suffering. And unlike some teachers who try to make us embarrassed about our desire for happiness or denounce it as selfish, he said that there's nothing wrong with the desire for happiness, it's just that we go about it the wrong way. He also said that if you can focus on this issue and clear up this issue, you take care of everything else. So we have to look at the issues we carry into the practice: old wounds, old battles, old issues. How many of them are worth carrying or continuing to carry? How many issues can we take on and actually handle properly? We hear about people who ND that they only have a few months left to live, and they suddenly change their way of living. They get a sense of what's important to them and what's not, and they let the unimportant things fall aside. It's good that they do this, but it's a shame that they had to wait until the last 3 months. As the Buddha said, you should be prepared to go at any time, which means you have to really pare down your issues right now. I was reading a while back about a woman general in the army who every day at the beginning of the day would make a list of the 10 most important things that had to be done that day, in order of importance. Then she would strike out the last 8 and focus on the rest 2. The Buddha would have you focus on 1. What's the cause of your suffering right now? Where is your suffering? This is not a selfish issue to focus on, because if you can't handle your own suffering, it tends to spill out onto other people. So we owe it both to ourselves and to others to focus on what we're doing that's unskillful, and have some goodwill for ourselves to see that our desire for happiness is something to be honored, something to be aspired to. But we want to make it a genuine happiness, a solid happiness, a reliable happiness, a harmless happiness. In other words, we really wish ourselves well. We get practice with the breath. The other day, we were talking about having an issue with being friends with your breath. If you can't be friends with your breath, how are you going to be friends with anybody? You have to stop and ask yourself, what's the problem? Is the breath the problem, or is it something else inside? A lot of us come from other traditions where we're taught to think very little of ourselves, and we either accept that or react in the opposite direction. But neither of those attitudes is helpful. Simply wish yourself well. As for the question of whether you or anyone else deserves to be happy, the Buddha never talked about deserving. He was here to put an end to suffering, whether deserved or not. That's pretty radical. You know the story about Angulimala, who had killed 999 people and then, not long after the Buddha taught him, became an arahant. A lot of people like that story. It shows that no matter what your background, there's hope. But we have to remember that, at the time, there were a lot of people who didn't like what had happened and were pretty upset. Here was Angulimala, who had killed all these people, and he was literally getting away with murder. You could say that he deserved to suffer, but the Buddha didn't take that into consideration at all. He said, here's a person who's suffering really badly, and his suffering is spilling out and affecting other people. By curing Angulimala's suffering, or showing him how to cure his zuering, he saved a lot of other people, too. So if there's the question of whether you deserve to be happy or not, you learn how to put that aside. Realize that that's a non-issue. The issue is that you've got actions. The mind is an active principle. This is something Ajahn Mun talked about a lot. As he said, the mind ows out. There's the source of the mind, like the source of a river. Things keep owing out. And that's the problem. It's not that things outside are coming in to cause problems. The problem is in the way we ow out toward things. And it's not going to stop unless we learn how to do it really skillfully. Our actions are really, really important. There was a teaching current in the time of the Buddha to the effect that the only real things in the world are the basic elements: earth, water, wind, re. They had a few other elements as well, but the elements were the only things that existed. Actions were non-existent. Thoughts were non-existent. This also meant that there was no basis for precepts. As they said, when a knife went through somebody's neck, it just went between the atoms, so there was nobody there to be killed, and the movement of the knife was unreal. Only permanent things were real. The Buddha's teachings are the other way around. Your actions are what are real, that have the most reality. The world out there is not the issue. The world that you experience comes from your actions. Your actions are more solid, more powerful than your experience of earth, wind, water, re, and all the other elements. That's a pretty radical statement. This is why the Buddha keeps focusing back on what you're doing right now, because what you're doing right now is the big shaping force in your experience. And all of us, regardless of our past, regardless of what other people have told us, have the perfect right to learn how to act skillfully, to end happiness. So learn to see the issue of genuine happiness as the big issue. Learn to see the issue of genuine zuering as the big issue, too. They go together. And have some goodwill for your own happiness. It's interesting that when the Buddha talks about people who are wealthy but extremely miserly and frugal, he doesn't say that it's really good that they've learned how to put aside sensual desires. He said there's something really wrong with them. If they can't learn how to appreciate some pleasures for themselves, how are they going to appreciate other people's having pleasure? They're going to be jealous. They're going to be resentful. So he does encourage sensory pleasure in moderation. He says there are pleasures that are perfectly harmless for the mind. You have to look at your own mind, though, to gure out which ones are harmless for you and which ones are not, because it's not the same for everyone. And then you realize that even though harmless pleasures give some relief to the mind, they don't leave it fully satisfied. What would be a higher level of pleasure? The word sukha runs everywhere, from just plain old physical pleasure, ease, well-being, all the way up to bliss. Nibbana is the ultimate sukha. The Buddha doesn't want you to be afraid of pleasure. He says to learn how to appreciate which pleasures are actually helpful for you on the path to the ultimate pleasure, and which ones get in the way. The same with pains. Some pains are helpful for you on the path. You want to learn how to use both pleasure and pain, and not be overcome by either. But the purpose of all this is to create in the mind a state of genuine well-being and concentration. When you have that well-being, what misery is there to slosh out on other people? For most of us, we're miserable and we slosh our misery out on others, thinking that we're lightening our load, but it just makes things worse. Well, you can take care of the source of this sloshing stew inside. You being tea. The people around you being tea. When the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths, they weren't just four interesting facts about an interesting problem. He said that this is the big issue, the fact that you're causing yourself zuering, but you have the ability to learn how not to. So, given the little time that we have, it's important that we focus our energy on solving the problem that's the big problem, the problem that, once it's solved, gets everything else solved. Look at your attitude toward happiness, look at your attitude towards zuering, and see if you can bring those attitudes in line. The Dhamma that the Buddha taught is for the purpose of putting an end to zuering and finding true happiness. These are the issues that are important. Anything that gets in the way of those issues, you can put aside. We read about those people in the time of the Buddha who came to him with this questionnaire. Is the world eternal? Is the world not eternal? Is it night? Is it a night? Is the soul the same thing as the body? Is it different? What happens to awakened people after death? Do they exist, not exist? Both, neither? And to us the questionnaire looks very bizarre. Yet we tend to have our own issues, and sometimes they're even stranger than that. There was the monk who said he wouldn't practice the Buddha's teachings unless the Buddha gave his answer to those questions. The Buddha said, "Well, you're going to die before you hear me answer those questions." We all know the story about the arrow. The man is shot by the arrow and he tells the doctor, "I'm not going to take the arrow out until I've found out who made the arrow, what wood it was made out of, what kind of feathers it was made with, and what was the caste of the person who shot me." The man would die before he learned the answers to those questions. We see other people's issues as ridiculous in that way. We have to learn to see a lot of our own issues as ridiculous in that way, too, the issues that are getting in the way of our gaining the most from the fact that we've been exposed to the Buddha's teachings, and we have the chance to practice them, at least for now. The positive side of heedfulness. December 25, 2015. If you could boil the practice down to one word, the word would be heedfulness, appamata. As the Buddha said, all skillful qualities have their foundation in heedfulness. They're rooted in heedfulness. And even the Buddha's last words were to obtain completion through heedfulness. When we hear the word appamata could also be translated as being uncomplacent, we tend to think of its negative side. A warning that there are dangers out there and in here, in the mind, and you've got to be really careful. If you make a misstep, you could get yourself into really deep trouble. That's one side of heedfulness. But heedfulness also has a more positive side as well. After all, the Buddha's pointing to the fact that your actions do make a difference, and they can make a very positive difference. There's that reaction about the heedful monks who think of death with every in and out breath, not to be afraid of death or to get morbid, but to remind themselves, "I could do a lot with this one breath I may have left. Or in the time it takes to chew this mouthful of food, I could do a lot in the practice." This attitude focuses your attention on the positive things that can be done with the little amount of time you might have. And this doesn't have to be just the little amount of time before death. It can also be the little amount of time you have where you stopped at a stoplight, taken a small break at work, when you're waiting in a doctor's OC, when you're waiting for the meditation session to begin. It seems like just a little bit of time, but often, with little bits of time like that, we tend to kill them. Well, there's nothing much I can do now, so I might as well just relax for a bit or whatever. But actually there's a lot that can be done in little bits of time. Insights can come very suddenly and unexpectedly. So try to create the conditions for them, even if you have small amounts of time. Don't underestimate what you could do. In Thai, when they took over the word for heedlessness, pamata, from Pali, they turned it into pramit, which developed its own meaning in Thai. Pamata means heedless. Pramit means to underestimate someone or something, but it has the same double meaning, negative and positive, as heedfulness. On the one hand, don't underestimate your enemies or the dangers you face inside, but also, on the other hand, don't underestimate yourself. You've got potentials that you can develop, and you can do a lot of good with your potentials. This applies not only as you're sitting here meditating, using your ingenuity and your powers of observation to get to know the breath, and to gure out what you can do with the breath energy, but also when you use those same qualities as you go through the day. All too often we think of the practice as simply what we do when we're sitting with our eyes closed. But practice is practice everywhere. You've got the same mind, the same qualities of mind that you want to develop, simply in different circumstances. When you're at work, you have opportunities to develop all the perfections. That's practice as well. You can focus on developing powers of patience and endurance, or you can focus on your discernment because work does require discernment. We had a question today about whether creativity was in line with the Dhamma as you work. Well, it's an exercise of your discernment. Again, all too often, We think of discernment as simply observing things as they're happening. But you don't observe things, really, by just watching them. You have to get involved with them. You have to create good things out of them, as we're doing with the mind right now. If you want to observe the mind, you have to put it into a state of concentration. You don't just sit here watching it as it's doing willy-nilly whatever it's going to do. You have to direct it to an object. Bring it to oneness ekagata. Ekagata is sometimes translated as one-pointedness. Eka, one, aga, point, ta, ness. But the word aga in there can also mean gathering place, which seems to be a more appropriate translation. Give the mind one gathering place where all of its activities can focus, and use all its sensitivities to guru out what will get it into a place where it really likes to be. Where would you really like to gather right now? And once you've gathered there, what's good about it and what's not so good about it? If it's not good, what can you change? Use your sensitivity. Use your ingenuity. Change the breath. Change the way you focus. Change the way you adjust the breath. There are lots of different ways of adjusting the breath. Sometimes you put a little pressure on the breath. Other times you just pose an image in the mind and see how the breath responds. Then you pose another image to see how the breath responds then. Then for the fun of it, reverse the images to see if that's any better. For instance, after imagining the breath going out to the hands as it comes in, think of it coming into the hands and going up your arms. This is called using your ingenuity. You encounter things you don't like in the meditation? Okay, how do you work your way around them? How do you live with them? You've got a pain in some part of the body? Work around it. You don't focus directly on it. As you work with this issue, you begin to realize that the extent to which a pain has an impact on the mind has an awful lot to do with how you engage with it. It's not just a brute fact that has nothing to do with your own involvement. There are potentials coming in from your past karma, but you've also got your present karma. Make the most of that fact, so that even when you encounter situations you don't like, whether in the meditation, your work, your family life, or your responsibilities around the monastery, see what you can do not to sewer around them. When I was with Ajahn Fuang, it always seemed that his bouts of psoriasis came at really inconvenient times. Not that I ever wanted him to have a bout, but it sometimes seemed that it was the worst timing in the world in terms of other projects I had to do around the monastery. So whatever else I was doing at the time, I just had to drop it. And then I began to realize that the timing that I thought was bad timing was simply getting in the way of my desires for what I wanted to do. So I had to guru out what was making me miserable around that, and learn how to drop it. When you learn to do this, you can live with a lot of situations that you couldn't stand otherwise. As Ajahn Fuang himself would often say, "What do you mean, you can't do this? Is it going to kill you to do it?" Well, no. Then you can do it. You have to be up for whatever presents itself. This, too, is a development of the qualities you need in the practice, your powers of patience and endurance, your powers of equanimity. And learn to think of these things as powers or strengths. Equanimity is not just a weak endurance. It's being okay with whatever comes up and ready to deal with whatever problems come up as they arise, even when they're coming at really bad times and going against what you would much rather do. But it's a strength to have equanimity. So look at all the perfections that you could be developing in different ways throughout the day. These are your opportunities. For example, with this one breath here, what's the opportunity right now? Well, you're meditating formally, where you can give the breath your full attention. Work at that. Make the most of what you've got. Make the most of this breath and then this breath. Really give your full attention to each breath. As for other moments when you're not sitting here with your eyes closed, make the most of them, too. Realize that a lot of good can be done each time you breathe in, each time you breathe out. Look for those opportunities. That's also what it means to be heedful. You're not just looking for dangers. You're looking for opportunities. Sometimes the opportunities are really challenging, but you want to be up for the challenge. That's the positive side of heedfulness. So don't underestimate yourself. Don't underestimate the dangers out there, but also don't underestimate the possibilities in here. The opportunities are out there and in here as well. A lot of good can be done in the world. A lot can be done inside. We don't have much time. Even when people have had a long life, 100 years, at the end of the life, it's not that they have all 100 years present right there. All the 100 years have gone, and there's just this moment. It all seems so small at that point. Realize that you've got this moment right now. It's an opportunity right now. Don't be heedless of the opportunities, because little moments can open up large areas inside the mind, large areas of goodness inside the mind, large areas of goodness in the world. Keep looking for those potentials. A true person. September 28, 2014. There's a term in the Pali, sapurisa, that can be translated in a lot of different ways. A person of integrity, a mature person. Literally, it means a true person. The Buddha often pairs it with a noble person. It's the kind of person you want to associate with, the kind of person whose habits you want to pick up, the kind of person you want to become. As he said, this sort of person has 7 qualities. The RST is one you can learn from books. Dhammanuta, having a sense of what the Dhamma is. Back in the time of the Buddha, of course, when there were no Dhamma books, you had to learn the Dhamma from someone who'd memorized the Dhamma, which meant that you had to have respect for that sort of person, because nobody's going to teach you anything if you don't show respect. The attitude of respect helps you make the most of just being around the person. It makes you more open to that person's nuances, the person's ways of thinking, ways of dealing with other people. The more open you are, the more you pick up whatever good things there are in that person's behavior. So back in the time of the Buddha, even that RST quality of a true person knowing the Dhamma was something you had to pick up by being with a person. Nowadays, of course, there are books and Dhamma talks out on the internet, so it's pretty easy to learn what the Dhamma is. But then you come to the next quality, which is knowing the meaning of the Dhamma. Athanuta, you come to realize more and more that you don't really know the meaning of the Dhamma until you've been with a person who embodies the Dhamma. Look at all the Buddhist scholars who have read books for years and years and know all the languages. They can come up with pretty crazy interpretations. One recently came up with the idea that the Brahma Viharas are an alternative path, a complete path to awakening. All you have to do is just sit there and think thoughts of goodwill, and that should take you all the way to Nibbana. This was from a scholar who'd studied Buddhism for many years, but who was more interested in reading between the lines than in taking seriously what the lines had to say. That the Brahma Viharas, on their own, don't lead to the dispassion required for Nibbana. So just being with the books doesn't mean you're going to understand them. But if you live with someone who embodies the teaching, embodies the practice, you get a sense of, oh, this is what's meant by this quality, this is what's meant by that quality. It's an intuitive sense that you pick up by being around a person who embodies it. So what are some of the things you want to look for? Begin with the next quality, matnuta. Gaining a sense of what's enough conversation, enough food, enough sleep. You see the other person, and it's not just a matter of seeing the other person. You listen to the person's ways of working things out for him or herself. The right amount of food and sleep for one person may not be the right amount for you. Or the right amount for you this week may not be the right amount for you next week. So you want to get a sense of how that person reads things in him or herself, so that you can read them in yourself. As the Buddha said, there are times when you can indulge in sensual pleasures of certain sorts, and they don't have any impact on your practice. They don't pull you back, so they're perfectly okay. As he said, he doesn't criticize pleasure that is in accord with the Dhamma. But if you when indulging in sensual pleasures, though they may seem innocent enough that over time you're beginning to get lazy and heedless, you've got to realize, put those pleasures aside. I'll have to practice with some pain. For the Buddha, practicing with pain meant both physical pain and the practice of contemplating the foulness of the body, which is an unpleasant topic. It's not one that's easy to keep at. But there are times when you've got to do it. Otherwise, your mind's going to go running wild with its desire for pleasure. So you have to learn a sense of what's right for you at a particular time. You have to learn how to read your own behavior. And you can develop a sense of this by being around someone who's learned to read his own behavior. It's an intuitive sort of thing. This ties in with the next quality, atnata, which means knowing yourself. Where your strengths are, where your weaknesses are, what you've got to work on. If you know you have a tendency toward extreme behavior, you've got to calm it down. If you know you have a tendency to lie to yourself, you've lied to yourself in the past, you've got to be extra on top of things. Wherever you know your weaknesses, learn how to compensate. And living with a good person helps with this, because you get a sense of where balance is, and how to recognize a weakness as a weakness. Kalanata. Knowing the right time and place for things, when to speak, when not to speak. Staying with Ajahn Fuang, I knew that he had some pretty sharp opinions. But he didn't talk about them all the time. There were times when I was waiting for him to give somebody a good blast, and he didn't. There were other times when it came out of left field. I didn't expect it at all. So I had to learn how to notice, okay, what would make him make a critical remark, or be very frank about something at some times. And other times, why would he not be so open with his opinions? This was just one of many things that had to do with the right time and the right place. There was also the issue of the times to be familiar with him, as opposed to the times when he was going to be distant. It took a while to learn how to read these things. But then I found it was very useful. I learned how to read other people a lot better, too. I found that my dealings with senior monks in Thailand in general got a lot smoother because I had that experience with Ajahn Fuang. When he was sharp with me when I tried to be too familiar, it was only at the right time. Having a sense of time and place. This is a really important part of the practice. It's not something that can be taught in books, but you can pick it up by being around good people. This connects with the next quality, which is having a sense of how to behave toward different groups of people. In India, of course, there were very clear social divisions. There were Brahmins, there were noble warriors, there were householders, and people of the lower caste. Each caste had a particular way of behavior that was appropriate for it. Ajahn Lee makes a lot of this point. He says that when the Buddha was with old people, he would make himself old. In other words, he'd think about the kinds of things they were thinking about, talk in terms of their language. When he was with younger people, he would adjust his language and his manner to be right with younger people. And even though we don't have castes in our modern society, we do have lots of different groups of people with whom you have to learn how to speak and behave in the right way. Especially as monks, we want to learn how not to be offensive. Think about the story of Sariputta's encounter with then Assaji. Assaji's manners were what impressed Sariputta. They made him want to learn from him, to ask him questions. Can you make your manners like that? You want to learn the proper manners for dealing with different people of different sorts, where something that's too familiar with one sort of person might be too formal for another, or vice versa. If you've got a good teacher, I can't say that I'm 100% skilled in this particular area, but I'm learning these are important skills to master. We tend to forget that there's a social dimension to the practice. All the time we think of the practice as sitting here with our eyes closed or doing walking meditation. But there is the practice of how to get along with one another. You have to learn how to get along with all kinds of people. In my life as a monk, I've met lots of people from different social strata that I never would have met otherwise, both on the high end of the scale and on the lower end. But you have to learn how not to think of them as higher or lower, simply, this person requires this kind of behavior. You want to speak to their hearts. You don't want your manners to get in the way. Finally, there's a sense of how to judge people. All too often we hear that as Buddhists we should try not to judge anybody, but you have to judge who you can take as a good example. The Sutta on the qualities of a true person says that people who are willing to listen to the Dhamma are a good example. The people who pay careful attention, who try to think the Dhamma through. They're a good example. The people who put it into practice, they're a good example. So you look for people whose behavior is exemplary. They pull you up and make you a better person because you want to be like them. All of these things are qualities that are named in a book, but you can't learn them from a book. You have to be sensitive to what's going on inside you, what's going on outside you, because this kind of sensitivity helps you read subtle things in your own mind as well. You learn to be observant, you learn to have a sense of the right time and the right place, and how much is enough in the area of the practice. How much is the right amount of time to sit and meditate? How much is the right amount to walk? How much pain should you sit with so that you can learn from it when you're ready for that kind of pain? How much pleasure can you indulge in without its being detrimental to your practice? These are all important questions you have to learn how to ask yourself. So try to be observant of good people so that you can get a sensitivity to what would be a good answer. If you want to be a true person, a mature person, these are the qualities you want to work on. They permeate everything in the practice. Adult Dhamma. March 5, 2015. I was reading a review of a short story collection recently, in which the reviewer was noting that although the author wasn't experimental in the way she structured her stories, she was revolutionary or radical in that she treated her characters like adults and her readers like adults. Unfortunately, that's pretty rare. The same observation applies to the different religions of the world. The Buddha is one of the few religious leaders who actually treated his followers like adults. There's very little in his teachings to baby you, to please your dilemmas, or to pander to your desires. They point to the fact that there is a really important problem in life, and that, if we train ourselves to be responsible, we are capable of solving it. That problem, of course, is the sewering that the mind creates. And the solution is a skill. It requires a lot. You have to sort out a lot of things inside yourself and shed a lot of your childish expectations. So the question is, do you want to be an adult? If you do, this is what you have to do. Look at yourself very carefully. Sort things out inside. Accept the fact that there is a right path and a wrong path, and you're responsible for making the right choice. This point was driven home for me recently by something else I was reading. A modern Dhamma teacher was talking about how important it is to have a sense of exibility on the spiritual path, saying that there are many different ways of getting to the goal. There's no one right way, and none of the ways, he said, are actually wrong. So you have to learn how to adjust and play with your practice. Now, even though it is true that there's an element of play in the practice, it's not true that there are lots and lots of right paths up to the top of the mountain. If you've ever been on a mountain, you've probably noticed that some paths go to the top, some go other places, some lead you over the edge of a cliff. It's the same with the rivers in the world. They don't all out into the ocean. Some of them out into the Great Basin, some into Lake Eyre in the middle of Australia. They just disappear into the sand. Two things were especially disturbing about this particular teacher's observation: that all paths are correct, and that we have to be mature enough and have a broad enough vision to embrace them all. The RST was his saying that the path is basically a matter of learning to embrace our sufferings together with our pleasures in the world, to realize that you can't have the pleasures without the sufferings, which is pretty much saying that there is no real end to suffering. The other disturbing point was that he illustrated his principle with a story about a high school basketball coach who'd been hired to coach a team of specially handicapped kids. Originally, the coach had had all kinds of plans for how he was going to whip the kids into shape in spite of their handicaps. But in the RST Day session, he realized that he was going to have to scrap his plans. It took him 45 minutes just to get the kids to line up on one side of the room, facing in the same direction. This made him come to the conclusion that they were not there to win, they were there to have a good time. So he fostered an environment in which they did have a good time. Everybody got hot dogs, everybody got prizes, you could stop the game at any time to dance. You could push the score button any time you felt like it. There was one game in which one kid really got into pushing the score button, and they ended up with 1,000,000 points. On the surface it's a nice story. But when you think about it a bit, it's pretty disturbing. This is spiritual practice? Throwing out the rules, giving prizes to everybody? To say nothing as to whether the coach's treatment of the kids was really the most skillful thing he could do for them, there's still the question of what the Dhamma teacher was saying about the basic spiritual problem when he used this story as a parable for spiritual practice, and how he viewed his students. If sewering weren't a real problem, and there weren't a real solution to it, then maybe the compassionate thing would be not to place burdens on people, not to set high standards for them, not to try to force them to develop any skills that required work, or even to tell them that they should or could develop any particular skills. But the thing is, sewering really is a problem. It really squeezes the heart and keeps on squeezing. That, in fact, was Ajahn Mahabua's definition of stress. Whatever puts a squeeze on the heart, it forces its demands on you. So if there's a path to put an end to those demands, to free the heart from that squeeze and those demands, then regardless of what it requires or how stringent it might be or how much effort it takes, to encourage people to take that path and to see it as the path, is actually an act of compassion. Now, the idea that anything goes in spiritual life actually dates back to the Romantics. Their idea was that you're trying to embrace the whole world, the initude of the world, and that requires you to step back and look at yourself from an innate perspective. From that perspective, you realize that whatever you might think, no matter how sincerely you might think it, can be only one small possibility among all the innate possibilities in the world. This is supposed to open you up to being more creative in your expression of your spiritual feelings, and not being bound by things that you or anyone else has expressed in the past. Religious truths, for them, were simply works of art, expressing your feelings on the subject of innate. And, as when you're making any new work of art, you don't have to be consistent with the works of art you did before. After all, you're not expected to give a true description of innate, because no innate being can do such a thing. The only truth that's asked of you is that you're true in how you express your feelings about innate, as you feel them right here and now. It all sounds very large-minded. An art expressing innate. And because it's art, it sounds like it's something higher than a craft. But what the Buddha taught was a craft. Instead of trying to be an artist, he took on the role of a master craftsman. He had mastered this skill and he wanted to pass it on to us. It's a very focused skill, focusing in on your mind and seeing what in the mind causes you to create sewering. It's also a battle. There's winning and losing. There's doing the skill well and there's doing it poorly. Now, there's a frame of mind that thinks that this sort of dualistic thinking is narrow. A craft focused on the issue of sewering sounds less exalted than an art focused on innate. But when you look at the results, you realize, in this case, that the craft is better than the art. Instead of leaving you to wallow around in the expression of your feelings, it actually accomplishes something. It takes you out of sewering entirely, to a dimension beyond the world. And it honors you by saying that you're capable of doing this. So, the Buddha's not handing out hot dogs to everybody. But he is doing something much more compassionate. Treating us like adults and asking us, do we want to be adults, too? If we do, this is how we do it. And even though it's just a craft and not a creative, expressive art, it takes us a lot further than just learning to be expressive. And the results are a lot larger, more encompassing, and far more worthwhile. Clinging, addictions, obsessions. December 27, 2015. As the Buddha said, sewering is the clinging aggregates. The aggregates themselves are related to the way we feed, and clinging is related to the way we feed as well. The word for clinging upadana can also mean sustenance and the act of taking sustenance from things. Of course, we don't usually think of feeding as sewering. For most of us, that's how we get our pleasure in life, that's how we keep going as beings. We take lots of pleasure in thinking about feeding, planning for feeding, and then in the actual feeding itself. This is where the Buddha's teachings go against the grain. But our suring is strong, so it needs something that goes very strongly against the grain, against our attachment to our suring, if we're going to end it. As Ajahn Suwat used to like to say, our likes are what makes us suer. Food is one of the big likes in life, and the act of feeding is one of the big likes in life, too. So we need pretty strong medicine to counteract our attachment to them. When you look at the types of clinging, you'll see that they're very closely related to the way we feed. Sensuality clinging has to do with our fascination with thinking about the food we're going to take, what we're going to have tomorrow, how we're going to exit, how good it's going to taste. We can think about that for long periods of time, much longer than the actual amount of time we spend eating the food. Then there's clinging to habits and practices. The way we feed, the kinds of things we will do in order to get food, our ideas of which ways of looking for food are legitimate and which ones are not, and, once you've got the food, how you exit. We tend to identify ourselves very strongly with this. People who are vegan, people who are gluten-free, people who won't take soy, people who eat nothing but soy. The list is very long. It just keeps getting longer and longer, it seems. As for how the food has to be said, there are lots of views in the world out there. What counts as food, what doesn't count as food, which foods are worthwhile, which ones are not. This morning I was mentioning to a group of visitors the fact that I'm on statins right now, and I received a long series of lectures about whether they were good or bad. The same goes for lots of different kinds of foods. Finally, there's your sense of yourself as the person who's being fed by all this. Who you are, what kind of person looks for food in a certain way, what kind of person eats certain kinds of food, what kind of person is going to be benefiting from the food, what kind of person you're going to become as a result of eating in a certain way. We're all very much attached to these things. You see this particularly in our obsessions, our addictive behavior, because we feed not only on food, but also on types of behavior and ideas and our relationships with other people. Some of these things can get pretty addictive and obsessive, and we know they're unhealthy, but we keep going back for them. They're primary examples of what the Buddha's talking about when he talks about clinging, so it's wise to analyze them in the Buddha's terms. See that the strength of the addiction lies in the different kinds of clinging. For example, sensuality. Your fascination with thinking about how good it's going to be, the pleasure you're going to get out of that particular kind of thinking or addiction. And even when a large part of the mind realizes it's bad for you, there's another part that really goes for it and is thoroughly convinced it's a good thing. You have to ferret that out, and you have to argue with it. Then there are habits and practices. We tend to be very quick to fall into old habitual ways of behaving. And because we've practiced them so often and followed through with them so often, they seem almost effortless. Any other way of looking for pleasure goes very strongly against the grain. Our views about what types of pleasure there are out there, our views about how responsible we are for what's going to happen down the line. This is a big addiction, because the addictive mindset, the obsessive mindset, just says, well, I'm going to go for my pleasure right now, and who cares about the future because the future is uncertain, but this hit or this type of behavior seems to be pretty certain. That, too, is a kind of view. And your sense of who you are. When you start identifying with that addictive part of your personality, that becomes your identity, and you find it harder and harder to think about other ways of doing things, of being a person who does things in other ways. You tend to think that you're incapable of doing them. Or that you try for a while, and then you give up and say that that's proof you can't do it, that you can't get away from your old behavior. So we need strong medicine to counteract this. And this is what the Noble Eightfold Path is for. It's meant to attack these different kinds of clinging. Sensuality has to be replaced with right resolve and with the desire in right eart. You have to learn how to motivate yourself to say, there must be something better in life. You think about how much better it would be if you didn't give in to that particular kind of pleasure. Resolve for renunciation, for harmlessness. You don't want to harm yourself. You don't want to have ill will for yourself, because often there's that aspect to an addiction. You get apathetic about the impact of your pleasure-seeking and treat yourself as worthless. Instead, think about how good it would be to be free. Those two factors, right resolve and right ear, help to replace the clinging to sensuality. As for habits and practices, the path recommends that we take on new habits. The habits of right action, right speech, right livelihood. Take the precepts and you'll end that you can actually follow through with them, and that life really does get better as a result. You're creating fewer and fewer problems for yourself. Then there's the practice of concentration. This is right mindfulness and right concentration. You end that these alternative forms of pleasure are better to pursue and that you can tap into them. Addictive views, of course, have to be replaced with right views. One of the lessons of right view is that the important issue in life is not the pleasure that you're sucking out of life, but the things you're doing and the consequences they're going to have down the line. You have to take those things very seriously. Because, as Ajahn Suh would like to say, those sensual pleasures you had last week, where are they now? They're totally gone. But you are left with the karma. If you don't believe in karma, just look at the habits you've developed. You get into these old ruts. These old ways of thinking, these old ways of behaving. The more you indulge them, the harder they are to get out of. That's what you're left with. The habit, which is accompanied by a large sense of lack. You're left with the action. So you have to see this very clearly and realize that it's causing a lot of sewering. This is something that we tend to turn a blind eye to, both the sewering we cause ourselves and the sewering we cause to others. It's very easy to say, well, it doesn't matter, or it's unavoidable, or it's a part of embracing all of life. That's a big one. Recently I was reading somebody saying how life is wonderful, and therefore we have to see everything in life as wonderful, including aging, illness, death, and all the horrible things that people do to one another. But the Buddha never said that. You have to take seriously the fact that our actions are leading to sewering, and a lot of the sewering is pointless. It accomplishes nothing aside from bringing torment. So we have to replace the views of our addictive thinking with right views, starting with mundane right view about karma, and then right view about sewering and its causes. We have to see the sewering in feeding on our old behavior. That's sewering right there, and you've got to see it. So there we have all the factors of the path. As for the doctrines of the self, that's also related to right view, and in particular to your sense of who you are in relationship to the kinds of pleasure you like to think about, the skills you have. For most of us, addictive behavior comes from a lack of alternative skills. But if you practice the alternative skills, you become a new person. The kind of person who has those skills. As Ajahn Lee would often say, don't be too quick to go for inconstancy, stress, and not self. He says, you want to develop concentration so that you can have a sense of constancy in your mind, something that you can hold on to. Something that's pleasant, something that's under your control. There's going to be a sense of self you build around that then becomes your new sense of self, who makes it easier and easier to resist your old addictive self, with its addictive ways of thinking and its addictive behavior. So you take the path and you use it to counteract all your forms of clinging. And it's important to see that these teachings on clinging are not very abstract, they're very closely related to the way we feed other things. The path is there to give us an alternative way of feeding, a way that, instead of sapping our strength, actually builds our strength. It gets the mind more and more sensitive to what real happiness is. Because everything all comes down to this desire for happiness. Someone was saying today that she had trouble seeing that she deserved happiness. But the Buddha never talks about deserving happiness or not deserving happiness. He was here to put an end to sewering, whether deserved or not. We can think about lots of different ways we might deserve to sewer or other people might deserve to sewer, but that's part of our views that are making us continue to sewer unnecessarily. The opportunity to stop making yourself sewer is here. And in not placing the burden of sewering on yourself, you're putting less of a burden on other people. You're actually more able to help them. So learn to straighten out your views around this whole issue of feeding. Straighten out your fascination with thinking about sensuality. Start thinking about the topics of right resolve and right eart. There is desire therein. Right eart. In fact, it's an important part. You have to learn to want to do it. Learn how to talk yourself into wanting to follow the path. The parts of the mind that don't like to meditate will put up arguments, but you've got to have your arguments ready to go against them, so that you're not just going through the motions. You're actually looking directly into your breath right now, looking into your mind as it relates to the breath, so that you can understand it. Figure out this mind that's so obstreperous. You think it's you think it's yours, but there's so much in it that's going against your best interests. Learn how to be fascinated with trying to gure that out. Pick up the habits of the precepts, the practice of mindfulness and concentration, straighten out your views about what's important in life, what's possible in life, and you'll become a different person. And that different person will help carry you through not only getting over the addictive behavior, but also learning how to master the skills so that they go higher and higher. There really is this potential within us for something deathless, so why are we dithering around with things that we know are harmful for ourselves? The deathless is there. It's attainable. When you develop the sense of self that says, okay, I can do this, I want to do this, then you can learn the skills and ND that it's possible. Eventually, that sense of self will actually take you to the point where you don't need it anymore. And when you let go of it, you're letting go not because you're disgusted with it or angry at it, which is how we tend to let go of certain members of our committee of selves. It's a raft. When it's taken you to the further shore, you leave it on the shore, but you leave it with a sense of appreciation. It's something that you cling to as you get across the river, and then you can let it go. You're standing on RM ground, as the Buddha said. So use the path to get over all these forms of clinging. And even though you may not be on the RM ground of total awakening, UND that things are a lot more solid, a lot more reliable as you've got the path to hold on to. And you become more solid and more reliable, too. A better person to live with, both for yourself and for the people around you. In alignment with the Buddha's teachings, we underscore the tremendous significance of sharing wisdom widely. At present, we've converted this extensive 1,000-page work into a user-friendly audio format. The responsibility to advance this noble endeavor now lies with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and the sharing of our content, you play a pivotal role in the widespread distribution of these teachings, benefiting countless others. Let's continue the age-old tradition of knowledge dissemination and the nurturing of mindfulness for the greater good of humanity. We wholeheartedly invite you to join us in this undertaking, and together, we can effect profound and positive changes in the lives of many.